My fiancée swapped out my medication. I got suspicious when I couldn't focus long enough to finish a sentence. I took a pill to a pharmacist. It wasn't mine. It was hers. A mood stabilizer. She said it was to keep me calm until the vows. I canceled the wedding that night while she slept. The morning started like any other Tuesday, 3 weeks before my wedding to Charlotte. I reached for my daily medication, a simple prescription for anxiety that I'd been taking for 2 years, and swallowed it with my coffee. Charlotte had already left for her job at the marketing firm, leaving behind the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume and a note reminding me about the final cake tasting appointment that afternoon. By noon, something felt fundamentally wrong. The quarterly report I'd been working on for weeks suddenly seemed impossible to complete. Every paragraph I attempted dissolved into fragments before I could grasp the meaning. Words swam across my computer screen like fish in murky water, refusing to hold still long enough for comprehension. My colleagues noticed my distraction during the lunch meeting, where I found myself staring blankly at Lucas, our project manager, unable to process his questions about budget allocations or quarterly projections. The fog in my mind thickened as days passed. Simple tasks became mountainous challenges that required enormous effort to complete. I'd start sentences during phone calls and forget how to finish them, leaving clients confused and concerned. My handwriting became increasingly illegible, and I found myself making mathematical errors that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. My supervisor, Oliver, pulled me aside on Friday, expressing genuine concern about my recent performance decline and suggesting I might need time off. The wedding stress, I assured him, though privately I wondered if something more serious was happening to my brain. The possibility of early-onset dementia or some other neurological condition began haunting my thoughts during the brief moments when I could think clearly enough to consider such possibilities. Charlotte seemed unusually attentive during this period, bringing me herbal tea each evening and suggesting I rest more frequently. She'd watch me take my medication each morning with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between concern and satisfaction that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't articulate. When I mentioned my cognitive difficulties, she'd stroke my hair and suggest it was just pre-wedding nerves, perfectly normal for someone about to make such a significant life commitment. The symptoms intensified dramatically over the weekend. During our visit to her parents' house for a pre-wedding dinner, I struggled to follow conversations that should have been simple, nodding along while understanding perhaps half of what was being discussed. Charlotte's mother, Isabella, commented on how relaxed I seemed compared to previous visits, noting that I appeared much less anxious than usual and seemed to have found some inner peace. Her father mentioned that I seemed almost sedated, which Charlotte quickly dismissed as exhaustion from wedding planning and work stress. My attempts to research my symptoms online proved increasingly futile. My concentration span had shrunk to mere minutes before mental fatigue overwhelmed me. Medical websites became incomprehensible mazes of text that seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus. The irony wasn't lost on me that I couldn't focus long enough to understand what might be causing my inability to focus. Sleep became my refuge, though even dreams felt clouded and distant, lacking the vivid quality they'd always possessed. The cake-tasting appointment became a disaster. I couldn't distinguish between flavors that should have been obviously different, and my responses to the baker's questions were so delayed and confused that Charlotte had to answer for me. She apologized repeatedly, explaining that I'd been working too hard and was clearly overwhelmed by wedding preparations. The baker suggested we reschedule, but Charlotte insisted on making all the decisions herself, claiming she knew my preferences better than I did at the moment. That evening, I attempted to call my doctor, but found myself unable to articulate my symptoms coherently. The receptionist asked me to call back when I could better explain what was wrong, which only increased my growing panic about my mental state. Charlotte found me sitting on the bathroom floor, holding the phone and crying from frustration. She helped me to bed, speaking in soothing tones about how everything would be better after the wedding stress was over. By the second week, the mental haze had become unbearable and was affecting every aspect of my life. I developed a noticeable tremor in my hands that made typing difficult and caused me to spill drinks regularly. My speech had become notably slower and occasionally slurred, as if my tongue couldn't keep up with my thoughts. Coworkers were beginning to whisper, and I overheard someone suggesting I might be drinking during work hours. Charlotte suggested I see a doctor, offering to make the appointment for me, but whenever I tried to make one myself, I'd forget mid-conversation or become too confused to explain my symptoms coherently. She seemed to hover more closely during these attempts, often taking the phone from me and apologizing to medical receptionists for wasting their time with unclear requests. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating morning when I knocked over my pill bottle while reaching for my coffee. As I gathered the scattered tablets from the kitchen floor, I noticed something that sent a chill through my foggy consciousness despite the medication-induced numbness. The pills looked different, slightly larger, with a different coating and shape than I remembered from years of daily use. My prescription had always been small, white tablets with a distinctive score line down the middle that I'd become familiar with over 2 years of consistent use. These were larger, cream-colored, and completely unmarked. The difference was subtle but unmistakable once I focused on it with the kind of attention that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. I held one up to the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, comparing it to my memory of the medication I'd been taking faithfully for 2 years. The shape was wrong, the color was wrong, the texture was wrong. Everything about these pills contradicted my established experience. My hands shook as I examined the bottle more closely, noting that while the label bore my name and the correct medication information, the pills inside were clearly something else entirely. Charlotte found me standing in the kitchen, holding the bottle and staring at its contents with the first genuine focus I'd managed in weeks. Her face went visibly pale when she saw what I was doing, and for a brief moment, her carefully maintained expression of concern cracked completely. The mask slipped just long enough for me to see something cold and calculating underneath before she quickly recovered, suggesting that perhaps the pharmacy had made an error and offering to call them immediately to resolve the confusion. But something in her voice, a slight tremor, a barely perceptible pause before responding, a note of false surprise that rang hollow, triggered the first clear thought I'd had in weeks. This wasn't a pharmacy error. This was deliberate and calculated. Charlotte had been watching me take these pills every morning, had been bringing me water to wash them down, had been expressing concern about my condition while knowing exactly what was causing it. I pocketed several pills when she wasn't looking, telling her I'd handle the pharmacy call myself later that day. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of genuine alertness, though it might have been pure adrenaline cutting through the chemical fog. The haze was still there, still clouding my thoughts, but underneath it, a terrible clarity was beginning to emerge like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The rest of the morning passed in a strange dual state. Part of me remained clouded and confused, while another part began analyzing Charlotte's behavior with newfound suspicion. Her insistence on accompanying me everywhere suddenly seemed less like devotion and more like surveillance. Her dismissal of my symptoms as wedding stress took on a sinister quality when viewed through the lens of deliberate deception. I began noticing things I'd been too impaired to see clearly before. The way she'd guide conversations when I became confused, steering topics away from anything that might require me to think critically. How she'd answer for me in social situations, claiming to know what I wanted or thought. The satisfied expression that crossed her face when I'd struggle with simple tasks, as if my incapacity pleased her rather than concerned her. During lunch, I pretended to take my afternoon dose while actually palming the pill. Within hours, I noticed a slight improvement in my mental clarity, not dramatic, but enough to confirm that the medication was indeed the source of my cognitive problems. The realization filled me with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I wasn't developing dementia or suffering from some progressive neurological disease, but terror at the implications of what Charlotte had been doing to me. I drove to the pharmacy that afternoon, fighting through the medication-induced haze to focus on the road while experiencing the first hints of returning mental acuity. The drive itself was a revelation. I'd been avoiding driving for weeks, claiming I felt unsafe behind the wheel, but now I realized my reflexes and judgment had been severely compromised by whatever Charlotte had been giving me. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman named Olivia with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, examined the pills I'd brought with professional interest and growing concern. She disappeared into the back room for several minutes before returning with a concerned expression, a reference book, and what appeared to be a drug identification guide. The pills were mood stabilizers, powerful psychiatric medications typically prescribed for bipolar disorder and severe anxiety disorders, but at dosages far exceeding what would be appropriate for my actual condition. The specific medication she identified was known for causing exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing: cognitive impairment, confusion, memory problems, motor skill deterioration, and the emotional numbing that had characterized the past few weeks. Most disturbing was her professional observation that this medication, at the dosage indicated by the pill size and formulation, would make someone highly suggestible and compliant, essentially creating a chemically induced state of dependency and malleability. She recommended I seek immediate medical attention and consider filing a police report if I suspected I'd been given these medications without my knowledge or consent. I sat in my car outside the pharmacy for nearly an hour, pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place with mechanical precision. Charlotte's unusual attentiveness suddenly made sense. She hadn't been caring for a sick partner, she'd been monitoring the effects of her systematic poisoning. Her insistence on bringing me my medication each morning wasn't devotion, it was quality control. Her dismissal of my symptoms as wedding stress wasn't reassurance, it was misdirection. The investigation that followed consumed the rest of the week and revealed layers of deception I never could have imagined. I started taking only quarter doses of whatever Charlotte was giving me, allowing some mental clarity to return while maintaining the appearance of continued impairment. The gradual clearing of my mind was like emerging from a months-long nightmare into harsh daylight. I discovered that Charlotte had been refilling a prescription under her own name for the past month, the same medication she'd been substituting for mine. Her medical records, which I accessed through insurance information she'd left carelessly on our shared desk while handling wedding-related paperwork, revealed a history of psychological treatment I'd never known about, including prescriptions for the exact medications I'd been unknowingly taking. More disturbing were the discoveries I made while searching through her personal belongings during the hours she was at work. A journal hidden in her dresser detailed her growing concerns about my assertiveness in wedding planning, my questions about our shared finances, and my resistance to several major decisions she'd wanted to make unilaterally. The entries revealed a calculated plan to keep me docile and compliant through the wedding, with references to gradually reducing the medication afterward once we were legally bound. The most chilling entry, dated just days before she began switching my medication, contained detailed research into drugs that could make someone more agreeable without causing obvious physical symptoms. She'd consulted with a friend who worked in psychiatric nursing about medications that could achieve this effect, presenting it as concern for a hypothetical family member with severe anxiety who refused treatment. But the journal revealed something even more sinister. Charlotte had been systematically documenting my behavioral changes, noting which dosages produced which effects, almost like a clinical researcher studying a test subject. She'd recorded my increasing dependence on her for decision-making, my growing inability to function independently, and my transformation from an equal partner into someone who required constant guidance and supervision. The entries showed planning that extended months into the future. She'd researched the legal implications of various mental health diagnoses, investigated guardianship laws, and even consulted with lawyers about managing assets for someone with cognitive impairment. The picture that emerged was of someone who hadn't just wanted a compliant fiancé for the wedding, but who was systematically working to gain complete control over another person's life and assets. The complete picture that emerged was more horrifying than I could have imagined, revealing a level of premeditation and manipulation that bordered on the sociopathic. Charlotte had been systematically drugging me not just to keep me calm for the wedding, but to establish a pattern of dependency and incapacity that she could later use to justify taking control of every aspect of my life. I discovered joint accounts I'd never agreed to open, with my signature forged so skillfully that even I had trouble distinguishing it from my actual handwriting. Insurance policies had been altered to make her the primary beneficiary, and a power of attorney document existed bearing what appeared to be my signature, but which I had absolutely no memory of executing. The document was dated during the period when my cognitive impairment had been at its worst, when I'd been barely capable of coherent conversation, much less legal decision-making. Her plan extended far beyond simply having a peaceful wedding ceremony. The medication was meant to continue indefinitely, with dosages adjusted to maintain me in a state of functional but controllable impairment. She'd researched care facilities for people with early-onset dementia, investigated the process for having someone declared legally incompetent, and even contacted relatives to lay groundwork for explaining my supposed deteriorating mental condition. The journal contained detailed timelines and contingency plans that read like something from a psychological thriller. She'd prepared strategies for convincing doctors that I suffered from rapidly progressing cognitive decline, complete with fabricated family history of neurological disorders, and carefully documented behavioral observations that would support such a diagnosis. If I ever began to resist or recover, she had plans to increase medication dosages while simultaneously building a medical case for my institutionalization. Most shocking was the revelation that this wasn't her first attempt at such elaborate manipulation. References in her journal to previous relationships that had ended under mysterious circumstances, combined with online research I conducted once my mental faculties began returning, painted a picture of a systematic predator who targeted financially stable men during vulnerable periods in their lives. I found evidence of at least 2 previous engagements that had been suddenly called off, with former fiancés who had reportedly suffered nervous breakdowns or mysterious health crises. Online forums and social media posts from these men, which I tracked down through careful investigation, described symptoms identical to what I'd been experiencing: sudden cognitive decline, personality changes, and periods of confusion that doctors couldn't explain. The night before I planned to confront her, I made copies of all evidence and secured them in a safety deposit box at a different bank, one Charlotte had no knowledge of or access to. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in cases involving coercive control and chemical submission, providing him with the complete documentation of Charlotte's actions. The lawyer was amazed by the thoroughness of the evidence and assured me that criminal charges would be possible. I also filed a police report, though I was warned that prosecution would be challenging given the complexity of proving intent and the intimate nature of our relationship. However, the detective assigned to the case was intrigued by the systematic nature of the documentation and the potential connection to similar cases involving Charlotte's previous relationships. Charlotte returned from work that evening as usual, greeting me with the same concerned affection she'd shown throughout my weeks of impairment. She brought me herbal tea and asked about my day, inquiring whether my symptoms had improved and suggesting we might need to consult a neurologist if things didn't get better soon. Her performance was so convincing, so perfectly calibrated, that I almost doubted my own discoveries despite the overwhelming evidence. When she retired to bed, taking her own legitimate sleep medication, I began systematically dismantling the web of deception she'd constructed around our life together. I canceled every aspect of our wedding: the venue, the catering company, the florist, the photographer, the music, the officiant. Each cancellation felt like breaking chains I hadn't realized were binding me to a future that would have destroyed my autonomy completely. I contacted our wedding guests through a carefully worded group message, explaining that the wedding was canceled due to circumstances I couldn't discuss in detail, but assuring them that I was safe and making necessary changes in my life. The responses were immediate and largely supportive, with several people mentioning they'd been concerned about my behavior and appearance in recent weeks. The final step was the most emotionally difficult: packing my belongings while she slept, sedated by the same type of medication she'd been secretly feeding me for weeks. I moved through our shared space like a ghost, gathering possessions that represented my independent identity: books, personal documents, photographs from before our relationship, items that proved I'd once been a fully functional person capable of autonomous thought and decision-making. I left the evidence of her crimes carefully arranged on the kitchen table, along with a detailed note explaining that I knew everything about her systematic drugging, her financial manipulations, her research into legal guardianship, and her history with previous victims. I informed her that legal proceedings were already in motion and that she should contact a lawyer immediately. By dawn, I was staying in a hotel across town, finally free from the chemical prison she'd constructed around my mind, though still dealing with the physical and psychological aftereffects of weeks of systematic poisoning. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, protracted, and ultimately successful in ways that surprised even my attorney. Charlotte initially denied all accusations, claiming the medication switch was an innocent mistake made in her concern for my anxiety levels, and that she'd been trying to help me cope with wedding stress using her own prescribed medications. However, the overwhelming documentation in her own handwriting, combined with expert testimony from pharmacologists about the effects of the drugs and forensic analysis of the forged documents, ultimately supported multiple criminal charges including assault, coercive control, fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse through chemical restraint. The investigation expanded beyond our relationship when police connected Charlotte to similar reports from her previous victims. 2 former boyfriends came forward with nearly identical stories of mysterious cognitive decline, sudden personality changes, and financial irregularities that occurred during their relationships with her. One man had actually been hospitalized and underwent extensive neurological testing, never suspecting he'd been systematically drugged by someone he trusted completely. A third victim was discovered through social media investigation, a man who had died in a car accident during the period when he was reportedly suffering from confusion and disorientation. While his death couldn't be directly attributed to Charlotte's actions, the timing and circumstances raised serious questions about whether medication-induced impairment had contributed to the fatal crash. The case attracted significant media attention as an example of intimate partner abuse through pharmaceutical manipulation, highlighting how easily prescription medications could be weaponized by someone with access and knowledge. Medical professionals testified about the sophisticated understanding of drug interactions and dosages that Charlotte's scheme had required, suggesting she'd done considerable research into the clinical effects of various combinations. Charlotte was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for avoiding a trial that would have exposed even more victims and potentially resulted in a longer sentence. She was ordered to pay substantial restitution for the financial manipulation, medical expenses related to reversing the effects of the unauthorized medication, and damages for psychological trauma. The recovery process took the better part of a year and required both medical supervision and psychological counseling. Even after stopping the illicit medication entirely, I experienced withdrawal symptoms that included anxiety attacks, insomnia, and periods of disorientation as my brain chemistry gradually returned to normal. The cognitive effects lingered for months, with concentration and memory problems that slowly improved but never quite returned to pre-drugging levels. Trust became a significant challenge that extended far beyond romantic relationships into basic daily interactions, where I found myself questioning whether my perceptions and decisions were truly my own. Simple activities like taking any medication, even legitimate prescriptions, triggered anxiety about losing control of my mental faculties again. I developed compulsive habits around checking and verifying everything from medical prescriptions to financial statements. The financial damage was substantial but ultimately recoverable through the legal settlement and restitution orders. Charlotte had managed to drain nearly $50,000 from accounts she'd gained access to through forged documents and fraudulent authorizations, but most assets were protected through the swift legal action taken once I discovered her scheme. The greater cost was psychological. The violation of trust, the realization of how thoroughly my autonomy had been compromised, and the knowledge that I'd been utterly helpless while believing myself to be making free choices. Therapy helped me understand that I'd been the victim of a sophisticated form of abuse that was more common than most people realized, though rarely prosecuted due to the difficulty of proving intent and the private nature of intimate relationships. 3 years later, I've rebuilt my life with a clearer understanding of the warning signs of coercive control and a deeper appreciation for mental clarity and personal autonomy. The experience left me permanently changed but ultimately stronger, with an acute awareness of how easily trust can be weaponized and how important it is to maintain independence even within intimate relationships. I've become an advocate for victims of similar crimes, working with law enforcement to identify cases of pharmaceutical abuse and helping to develop protocols for recognizing the signs of systematic drugging in domestic relationships. The woman who tried to steal my mind and my future is serving her sentence in a facility 3 states away, but the lessons learned from her betrayal continue to inform every decision I make about who deserves access to my life and trust. The case has been used in training programs for medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and social workers to help them recognize the signs of pharmaceutical abuse in domestic situations. Charlotte's methodical approach and detailed documentation have become a textbook example of how intimate partner abuse can evolve beyond physical violence into more subtle but equally destructive forms of control and manipulation. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.